Imagine this. A man in a white lab coat tells you to press a button. On the other side of the wall, someone screams in pain. You hesitate, but then you press it again and again until the screams stop. You're not evil. You're not a sadist. You're just obeying. This isn't fiction. It's the Milgram Experiment, one of the most disturbing psychological studies ever conducted. It revealed something deeply unsettling about human nature. We're hardwired to obey authority, even when it violates our moral compass. The real horror? You probably would have obeyed too. Why do seemingly normal people follow orders that lead to pain, destruction, and even death? What switches off in our minds when someone in charge tells us what to do? And how far would you go just because someone told you to? This script dives into the unnerving truth, the psychology of obedience, how it works, why it works, and how dark it can really get. Once you understand the science, you'll never look at authority the same way again. The experiment that shocked the world. In the early 1960s, a quiet psychology professor at Yale University set out to answer a chilling question. How far will ordinary people go when instructed by an authority figure, even if it means hurting someone else? His name was Stanley Milgram, and what he uncovered would shake the foundation of how we understand human behavior. Milgram's experiment seemed harmless on the surface. Participants believed they were taking part in a study on memory and learning. They were told their role was to administer electric shocks to a learner every time that person gave an incorrect answer. The shocks would increase in intensity with each mistake. The learner, who was actually an actor and not being shocked at all, would scream, bang on the wall, beg to stop, and eventually fall silent. The authority figure, a stern man in a gray lab coat, would calmly urge the participant to continue. The experiment requires that you continue, he'd say.
No threats.
No violence. Just instructions. And yet, what happened next was horrifying. A staggering 65 of participants delivered the maximum voltage of 450 volts, enough, they believed, to seriously injure or even kill the other person. These weren't sadistic individuals. They were everyday people. Teachers, accountants, salesmen, students. They sweated. They trembled. Some laughed nervously. Some protested. But most of them kept going, simply because a man in a lab coat told them to. What made Milgram's study so terrifying wasn't just the behavior it revealed. It was how unexceptional the participants were. They weren't brainwashed. They weren't coerced. They were following instructions just like any of us might in a structured setting. The true shock wasn't the voltage. It was the realization that inside almost anyone, maybe even you, there's the capacity to obey orders that go against everything you believe is right. Milgram wanted to understand the psychology behind the atrocities committed during World War II. He wanted to know how people, many of whom later claimed they were just following orders, could participate in something as monstrous as the Holocaust. What he found was that obedience to authority is deeply ingrained. When someone we perceive as legitimate gives a command, especially in a controlled environment, our sense of personal responsibility can begin to blur. The command doesn't just come from someone else, it starts to feel like it comes from inside us. One of the most disturbing parts of the experiment was how the participants rationalized their actions. After the study, some said they didn't want to hurt anyone, but felt they had to. Others insisted they were just helping with science. A few minimized the learner's distress, convincing themselves it wasn't real or that the person would be fine in the end. These rationalizations weren't signs of evil, they were defense mechanisms. Their minds were trying to protect them from facing the full horror of what they'd just done. And that's where it gets even darker. Because it means we all have the potential to justify terrible actions if we believe we're serving a greater purpose, following rules, or being part of something bigger. You don't need to be cruel to do harm, you just need to stop questioning the orders you're given. Milgram replicated the experiment many times with different variations. Sometimes the authority figure wasn't in the room, obedience dropped. Sometimes the participant had to physically place the learner's hand on a shock plate. Obedience dropped even more. But the fact that even one person went all the way to 450 volts was enough to prove his point. Authority has a frightening grip on our minds. The Milgram experiment caused public outrage when it was published. Critics accused Milgram of manipulating people and causing psychological distress. But others defended him, arguing that the lesson he uncovered, the fragility of personal morality under pressure, was too important to ignore. In the end, his work became one of the most cited studies in all of psychology. It opened the door to deeper research on obedience, authority, and moral decision-making. What's more unsettling is how relevant the experiment still is today. Think about your own life. At school, at work, even online. How often do you comply just because someone in charge tells you to? How many times have you silenced your instincts, ignored your discomfort, or followed rules that didn't feel right, simply because it was expected of you? Milgram's work suggests that obedience isn't just something that happens in labs or history books. It happens in boardrooms, in hospitals, in classrooms. It happens in the everyday moments when people choose to remain silent, to conform, or to carry out instructions without question, even when those actions hurt others. There's a haunting quote Milgram once gave: "The essence of obedience is that a person views himself as the instrument for carrying out another person's wishes. In that moment, responsibility shifts. Morality detaches. The person stops being a moral agent and becomes a tool." That's the psychological horror. It's not that we're all potential monsters. It's that we can so easily forget we're human. By the end of the experiment, many participants were visibly shaken. Some wept. Some were angry. But most were grateful to have learned something about themselves. And maybe that's what makes the Milgram experiment so unforgettable. It didn't just reveal the dark side of obedience. It held up a mirror. And in that mirror, people saw a version of themselves they didn't know existed. And now that you've seen it too, the real question is, what would you have done? The psychology of obedience. When you hear the word obedience, it doesn't sound like a bad thing. It's how children learn, how laws are followed, how order is maintained. But when obedience becomes automatic, when it overrides your inner sense of right and wrong, it turns from structure into something deeply dangerous. To truly understand why so many people obey harmful authority, we need to look at the inner psychological forces that quietly guide us when someone else takes control. At the heart of obedience lies a powerful instinct, the desire to fit in and avoid conflict. Human beings are social creatures, wired to seek belonging. In evolutionary terms, being part of a group was once a matter of survival. So, when a person in a position of power gives a command, especially in a structured setting, our brain often interprets it as a social cue: follow, don't question. Disobedience feels like standing alone, and our instincts fight that feeling with everything they have. One of the key mechanisms behind obedience is something called agentic shift. Coined by Stanley Milgram himself, this term describes the psychological process where we stop seeing ourselves as autonomous individuals and start viewing ourselves as agents executing someone else's wishes. In this state, personal accountability fades. You're no longer acting on your own judgment. You're simply doing your job. Think of soldiers following unlawful orders, or employees staying silent about unethical decisions. Once the agentic state is activated, people become shockingly compliant. But why do we enter this state so easily? It begins with perceived legitimacy. When someone wears a uniform, has a title, or represents an institution, our brains often assign them automatic credibility. Whether it's a police officer, a doctor, or a corporate manager, their authority feels real, and challenging it can feel like rebellion. This is known as authority bias, and it's deeply rooted in us from childhood. We're taught early on to respect teachers, parents, elders. So when an authority figure tells us something, especially with confidence, we're primed to comply, even if part of us feels uneasy. Another powerful influence is conformity pressure. Imagine you're in a room with several people, and everyone says the answer to a simple question is C, even though you know it's A. Do you speak up? Or do you stay silent to avoid looking foolish? This exact scenario was tested by psychologist Solomon Asch in the 1950s. In his famous conformity experiments, about 75 of participants gave clearly wrong answers at least once, just to match the group. Why? Because the fear of standing out, of being the only dissenter, can override logic itself. Now combine that with a setting where not conforming doesn't just make you look foolish, but feels like breaking the rules. You're not just out of place, you're disobedient. That's the psychological cocktail many participants in Milgram's experiment found themselves drinking. And it's the same recipe used by countless systems of power throughout history. Let's not forget diffusion of responsibility. When people are part of a system or group, they often feel less individually accountable for what happens. I was just following orders. Everyone else was doing it. It wasn't really my call. This mental shortcut is protective. It shields us from guilt and shame. But it also weakens our moral instincts. In groupthink environments, it's easy to lose sight of what's right when everyone's too busy playing their part. There's also a more primal element. Fear. Sometimes we obey because we're afraid of what will happen if we don't. This doesn't have to mean direct threats. It could be fear of losing a job, being socially rejected, or getting labeled difficult. Authority doesn't always need to punish you to make you comply. Sometimes the mere possibility of consequence is enough. And fear, once triggered, can silence even the strongest inner voice. In modern psychology, there's another concept that helps explain all this: cognitive dissonance. This is the discomfort we feel when our actions don't align with our beliefs. For example, if you believe hurting others is wrong, but then obey an order that causes harm, your brain scrambles to make sense of it. To reduce the dissonance, many people rationalize their actions. It wasn't that bad. They told me it was necessary. Someone else would have done it anyway. These mental adjustments allow people to obey while still seeing themselves as good. Perhaps the most chilling part? Obedience often feels easier than resistance. Saying yes requires no justification. But saying no means pushing back, explaining yourself, risking rejection or punishment. In a high-pressure environment, where the person giving orders appears confident and composed, it's easier to comply than to confront. Psychologist Philip Zimbardo, who conducted the equally disturbing Stanford prison experiment, described this as the path of least resistance, the psychological slope that leads people to follow along, even when it feels wrong. But obedience isn't just a passive act. It's often rewarded. Systems, whether military, corporate, religious, or educational, tend to praise those who follow the chain of command. Promotions go to the compliant. Praise goes to the cooperative. And over time, those who question too much may be viewed as troublemakers. This creates a culture where obedience isn't just expected, it's incentivized. Still, not everyone obeys. In Milgram's experiment, some people did resist. They stopped early. They questioned the setup. They demanded the experiment end. So what made them different? Often, it came down to a stronger sense of personal responsibility, a refusal to hand over moral judgment to someone else. They listened to their discomfort, rather than suppressing it. They asked, "What am I doing?" instead of, "What am I supposed to do?" That question, simple but powerful, might be the thin line between obedience and resistance. The psychology of obedience is not about whether you're good or bad. It's about whether you're paying attention to why you're doing what you're doing, and whether you're willing to stop when something doesn't feel right. Obedience, at its core, is neither good nor evil. It's a tool. But in the wrong hands, or in the absence of self-awareness, it becomes a weapon. And the scariest part? You might never even realize you're holding it. When obedience turns dangerous, obedience might start with good intentions, following rules, keeping order, respecting leadership, but history has shown us what happens when that obedience is left unchecked. When authority becomes abusive and individuals stop questioning it, obedience turns toxic. It mutates from a social glue into a silent engine powering some of the darkest chapters in human history. The truth is, some of the worst atrocities the world has ever seen weren't committed by monsters. They were carried out by ordinary people who believed they were just doing their job. Take Nazi Germany. Millions were murdered during the Holocaust, and yet many of the people responsible weren't sadistic killers. They were clerks, train conductors, factory workers, police officers, people who stamped documents, scheduled transports, handed over names. During the Nuremberg trials after the war, countless Nazi officials defended themselves with one chilling phrase: "I was just following orders." That defense became so common it earned a name, the Nuremberg defense. And what made it so disturbing wasn't that it was dishonest. It was that, psychologically, it was often true. One of the most infamous examples was Adolf Eichmann, a key architect of the Holocaust. He didn't kill with his own hands. He organized train schedules, oversaw deportations, and ensured the efficiency of mass extermination. When he was captured and put on trial, people expected a monster. Instead, they saw a soft-spoken bureaucrat who insisted he was simply doing what he was told. Philosopher Hannah Arendt, who reported on his trial, described his demeanor as terrifyingly normal. She coined the phrase "the banality of evil" to describe how ordinary obedience, without reflection, without empathy, could lead to extraordinary horror. But this isn't just history. Obedience has caused destruction in corporate boardrooms, scientific labs, and modern-day institutions. Consider the Tuskegee syphilis study in the United States. For 40 years, from 1932 to 1972, the U.S. Public Health Service allowed hundreds of African American men to suffer from untreated syphilis, even after treatment became available, all in the name of research. Doctors, nurses, and administrators knowingly let these men deteriorate, lie to their families, and even die. Why? Because the system told them it was necessary. Because they were obeying the authority of science, of government, of research. And because no one stopped to say, "This is wrong." In the 1970s, the Stanford Prison Experiment conducted by psychologist Philip Zimbardo also showed how easily obedience can spiral out of control. In just a few days, college students who were assigned the role of guards began to torment their fellow students playing prisoners. They yelled, punished, dehumanized, not because they were evil, but because they believed they were supposed to. They were obeying the rules of the experiment. Even Zimbardo himself, the authority figure running the study, got swept up. It took an outsider, someone not involved, to shut it down. That's the terrifying pattern. When people are inside the system, it rarely feels dangerous. It feels organized, feels official. The more structured it is, the more legitimate it seems. People stop asking questions. They assume someone else knows better. They assume the consequences are someone else's responsibility. And that's when obedience becomes a mask, a way to avoid guilt, to avoid thought, to stay comfortable while harm unfolds right in front of them. Even in everyday settings, this danger lurks. In corporations, employees are often told to meet quotas, follow policy, and protect the brand. Whistleblowers, those who refuse to obey unethical orders, are frequently punished, ostracized, or ignored. The people who do obey aren't necessarily cruel. They just want to keep their jobs. They want to follow procedure. But when procedures protect harm, and when silence is rewarded, obedience becomes complicity. In hospitals, there have been cases where medical staff followed incorrect or dangerous instructions because the doctor in charge insisted. In one tragic case, a nurse administered a fatal dose of medication because a doctor told her to, even though her training told her it was wrong. Afterward, she said she felt frozen. She didn't want to be disrespectful. She was trained to obey, and someone died because of it. Obedience thrives in hierarchies, systems where authority is clearly defined and questioning it is discouraged. The military, for instance, relies heavily on obedience to function. Most of the time, that structure is necessary. But history has repeatedly shown how dangerous it becomes when orders turn unethical. In the My Lai massacre during the Vietnam War, American soldiers slaughtered hundreds of unarmed civilians, mostly women, children, and elderly people. When asked why they did it, many responded that they were simply following orders from their commanding officers. The scariest part? When obedience is rewarded and questioning is punished, systems train people not to think, but to execute. And once that habit takes root, it becomes automatic. People stop evaluating what they're being asked to do. They stop feeling the weight of their actions. They hand over their moral judgment to someone with a title or a uniform, and in doing so, they become part of the harm even if they never meant to be. But it doesn't take war or large-scale injustice to see this unfold. Look around, in schools, in companies, in governments. Obedience can lead to bullying that goes unchecked, discrimination that's enforced by policy, and corruption that flourishes behind closed doors. When people obey without questioning, without pushing back, systems become machines, and machines don't feel. They just operate. It's tempting to think, I would never do that. But the truth is, no one thinks they will. The people who delivered 450 volts in Milgram's experiment didn't think they were capable of cruelty. The guards in the Stanford prison experiment didn't walk in planning to humiliate others. They followed cues. They obeyed roles. And slowly, without realizing it, they crossed lines they thought they'd never cross. That's the true danger of obedience. It doesn't scream. It whispers. It doesn't begin with violence. It begins with quiet compliance. And by the time the consequences are visible, it's often too late. So the question isn't just how obedience becomes dangerous. The question is, how often is it already happening in plain sight while good people look away, telling themselves it's not their decision to make? Could you be controlled? You probably think you're in control of your own mind, that your choices, your morals, your limits, they're yours. But what if that sense of control is more fragile than you believe? What if, under the right pressure, in the right setting, you could be nudged or even pushed into doing something you never imagined? The uncomfortable truth is this: most of us can be controlled, not through force or threats, but through subtle psychological manipulation. And it doesn't take a lab coat or a military uniform. Sometimes all it takes is social pressure, a well-worded request, or the fear of standing alone. Let's start with something seemingly innocent: the foot-in-the-door technique. This is a well-known psychological tactic where someone gets you to agree to a small request first, and once you've said yes, they escalate to something larger. The logic: if you've already complied once, your brain wants to stay consistent. Saying yes again feels easier than saying no. It's been used in marketing, sales, even cult recruitment. And it works disturbingly well. Imagine a scenario: your boss asks you to stay late, just for an hour. You agree. Next time, it's 2 hours. Then it's a weekend. Before long, you're sacrificing your own time, energy, and values. Not because you're weak, but because each step felt reasonable. This is how control creeps in. It doesn't come all at once. It comes in increments, disguised as loyalty, responsibility, or team spirit. Psychologists call this gradual commitment. It's the same principle used in the Milgram experiment. Participants didn't start with the highest voltage. They began small, 15 volts at a time, and each step felt like just a little more. By the time they reached 450 volts, they had crossed so many small lines, it no longer felt like a jump, just a continuation. Now consider social proof. It's another powerful force shaping our behavior. When we're uncertain, we look to others to decide what's acceptable. If everyone else is obeying, staying silent, or going along with something unethical, we're far more likely to do the same, even if it makes us uncomfortable. Think about how often people laugh at jokes they don't find funny, or agree in meetings just to avoid being the lone voice. In group settings, silence can feel safer than integrity. This is why whistleblowers are so rare. Speaking out isn't just about moral clarity. It's about overcoming the paralyzing fear of being isolated. It's far easier to think, maybe I'm overreacting or someone else will say something, than to risk being the only person who pushes back. Another subtle method of control is framing. The way a situation is presented can dramatically alter your perception and response. In one study, participants were asked whether they'd support a policy that allowed 90 survival. Most said yes. But when that same policy was described as having a 10 death rate, support dropped, even though the numbers were identical. Words matter. Authority figures, whether in politics, business, or media, often manipulate framing to shape obedience. They don't say cutting benefits. They say streamlining services. They don't say civilian deaths. They say collateral damage. The goal is to make something harmful feel palatable. Then there's authority anchoring. When someone speaks or acts with confidence and status, people naturally defer. Think about doctors, CEOs, police officers. Their words carry extra weight. You may feel less inclined to question their decisions, even if something feels off. This isn't always bad. Experts exist for a reason, but when their power goes unchallenged, it creates a vacuum where critical thinking dies. In one famous real-world example, a man pretending to be a police officer called a fast food restaurant and convinced a manager to strip search and detain an employee, all over the phone. The manager complied, following the officer's instructions for hours, while committing serious abuse. Why? Because the voice on the phone sounded legitimate. Because authority was invoked. And because the people involved didn't question the situation until it was too late. Still think you're immune? Let's go deeper. Research in behavioral priming has shown that even subtle cues can influence how we act. In one experiment, participants who were exposed to words related to politeness were less likely to interrupt someone. In another, people who held a warm cup of coffee judged others to be friendlier. Our environment, what we see, hear, feel, shapes our behavior without us even realizing it. This doesn't mean you're a puppet. It means your mind is more suggestible than you might like to admit. That's what makes the idea of control so chilling. It doesn't always come from force or threat. It comes from comfort, from repetition, from the illusion that you're the one choosing, when in reality the boundaries of your choices have already been shaped. This is especially dangerous in digital spaces. Social media platforms, for instance, are designed to reward obedience to algorithms. The content you see, the posts you like, even the emotions you feel, all are subtly manipulated by unseen systems designed to capture attention. Over time, you begin to adopt the behaviors that the platform encourages. You get angrier, louder, more polarized, not because you intended to, but because that's the behavior that gets rewarded. In this way, even our digital obedience becomes profitable. So, could you be controlled? The science says yes. Not because you're weak, but because you're human. Because the mechanisms that allow society to function, conformity, trust in authority, willingness to cooperate, are the very same mechanisms that can be exploited to bend your will without you even noticing. The key isn't to reject all authority or become paranoid. The key is awareness. Understanding how these forces work gives you a fighting chance. It allows you to pause when something doesn't feel right, to question when your instincts are quieted, and to draw a line when someone tells you to cross one, no matter how small. Because once you've crossed enough small lines, turning back becomes harder than going forward. And that's exactly how people end up in situations they swore they'd never be part of. So ask yourself, when the moment comes, not with a shout, but with a whisper, will you recognize it? Breaking free. How to resist unjust authority by now. It's clear. Obedience can be dangerous. It can blur your judgment, silence your instincts, and turn you into a passive participant in harm, all while making you feel like you're doing the right thing. But if obedience is so deeply ingrained, is it even possible to resist it? Can you fight back against that invisible pressure when it shows up at work, in institutions, or even inside your own home? The answer is yes, but it takes more than just good intentions. It takes awareness, courage, and a commitment to something most people never even think about: moral independence. The first step is deceptively simple: recognize the moment. When someone in authority gives a command, we tend to slip into automatic compliance, especially if they sound confident or if everyone else is going along. But obedience isn't a reflex. It's a choice. It just doesn't feel like one in the moment. Resisting unjust authority starts with slowing things down, creating space between the order and your response. Ask yourself, why am I being asked to do this? Who benefits? Who might be harmed? In psychology, this pause is critical. It disrupts the automatic flow of obedience and reactivates personal responsibility. In Milgram's experiment, participants who stopped to ask deeper questions, who challenged the setup or focused on the learner's pain, were far more likely to disobey. It wasn't that they were braver or more intelligent. They were just more conscious. They stayed grounded in their own moral compass instead of outsourcing it to the man in the lab coat. The next step is learning to tolerate discomfort. Disobedience doesn't feel good. It often triggers anxiety, self-doubt, even guilt. That's because we've been trained, often since childhood, to associate compliance with goodness and rebellion with trouble. But resisting harmful authority means being okay with not being liked, with being the only person in the room who says, "This isn't right." It means accepting that doing the right thing might cost you something. History is filled with people who made that choice. Think of Rosa Parks refusing to give up her seat on a segregated bus. or Edward Snowden blowing the whistle on mass surveillance, or the nurses who refused to administer unethical treatments during medical experiments. These individuals didn't disobey because it was easy. They did it because the alternative was living with the knowledge that they had a chance to act. And didn't. Another tool is building moral clarity before you need it. In high-pressure situations, people often freeze because they're unsure what their boundaries are. That's why it's important to reflect on your values ahead of time. What are your red lines? What won't you participate in, no matter who tells you to? If you don't define them early, someone else might define them for you when it matters most. And you don't have to do it alone. Collective disobedience is incredibly powerful. When one person speaks out, they're often dismissed. But when 2, 3, or 10 people refuse to go along with something unethical, the authorities' power begins to crack. Studies show that even one ally dramatically increases the likelihood of others resisting. You don't need a majority to make a difference. You just need enough people willing to say, "We won't do this." This is where moral modeling becomes critical. When leaders, whether in companies, classrooms, or communities, demonstrate ethical resistance, it gives others permission to do the same. That's why culture matters. Environments that reward honesty, transparency, and reflection are far less likely to fall into dangerous obedience traps. But in environments where dissent is punished and conformity is praised, obedience becomes a fast track to harm. Technology also plays a role in both control and resistance. Surveillance systems, algorithms, and automated processes often disguise authority behind a digital interface. When a faceless system tells you what to do, whether it's a corporate policy, a social media platform, or a bureaucratic workflow, it can be easy to feel like there's no one to question. But resisting authority means remembering that every system is built by people, and those people can be challenged. Sometimes, the most important thing you can do is ask uncomfortable questions. Not to provoke or undermine, but to surface truth. Questions like, is this legal? Is this ethical? What are the consequences for others? These questions force people, including those in power, to confront the human impact of their decisions. They break the spell of passive compliance. And when authority punishes those questions, that's a sign the system itself is dangerous. But even when resistance fails in the moment, it's never meaningless. Every act of disobedience plants a seed. It shows others what's possible, creates ripples. Studies have shown that seeing someone else resist unethical authority increases your likelihood of doing the same later. In other words, your defiance might not stop the system, but it might inspire someone else to. Of course, not all obedience is bad. Society depends on cooperation. Rules exist for a reason, but the line between order and oppression is razor thin. And the most dangerous obedience is the kind that pretends to be necessary. The kind that hides behind phrases like, "We've always done it this way," or "It's out of our hands." The moment we stop examining what we're obeying, we open the door to systems that dehumanize, exploit, or even destroy. So how do you resist unjust authority? You notice the cues. You ask the questions. You speak when silence feels safer. You define your values before they're tested. You stand beside others who do the same. And when the pressure rises, you remember, obedience is easy, but integrity takes effort. The most chilling lesson from Milgram's work wasn't that people obeyed. It was that they obeyed while knowing it felt wrong. They hesitated. They winced. They questioned, but they still followed through. That gap between belief and action, that's where resistance lives. That's where you get to decide whether you follow or step away. Because the scariest part of blind obedience isn't what it does to others. It's what it turns you into.